So let's turn to David.
All right, thanks. And so what I want to do is take one kind of subset of compliance issues and use it in part as sort of a model or kind of testing area for some thoughts about how we approach an issue. And I think it builds nicely on what John has talked about in terms of thinking about how you build a more resilient system. And in particular, I want to talk about how, as a financial services community, we're dealing with the issue of cybersecurity. And it is an area that has kind of crept into compliance over the last several years, both because it's become increasingly prominent sort of in the rest of the world and because it is something that has increasingly drawn the attention of regulators. So the cybersecurity problem at a very high level, and I think what the securities and financial services industry is facing in this area really is not significantly different from what other industries are seeing, is that we have increasingly sophisticated sort of threat actors and an increasingly rich cybercrime kind of underground environment where people have the capability to act as market participants to buy and sell kind of components of services that allow them to commit malicious acts. The vulnerabilities that we face are varied and pervasive because at this point, especially in the financial services industry, absolutely everything is online. And the financial services industry has seen all of the kinds of attacks that we've seen in other parts of the industry, denial of service attacks that lock up significant participants in the industry, thefts of customer information, market manipulation, insider trading as a result of stolen market-sensitive information, the use of our filing systems to make electronic filings that are used to influence markets. And earlier this week, there were reports of phishing campaigns targeting high-level executives involved in corporate filing processes. The one thing we really have not yet seen in the financial services industry, and I think this is likely just a matter of time, is that the burgeoning network ransomware attacks have not yet really hit us. I mean, over the last year and a half or so, there's been an expansion of those kinds of attacks as people learn to lock up entire networks and hold them for ransom as opposed to just single computers. So how are we dealing, how should we deal as a financial services community with the rising importance of cybercrime? I mean, I think it starts by thinking about some of the ways that this problem is different than some of the other problems that we face in the kind of compliance and security area. Number one, attribution is much more difficult much of the time. A lot more of it is international than some of the typical problems we face. It is very easy to scale and to automate attacks. Victims often don't know they've been attacked until well after the harm is done. And we have the evolution of technologies, including anonymizer tools, digital currencies, which make it much more easy for the perpetrator to create barriers between the perpetrator and law enforcement detection and make it harder to recover stolen funds. What all of these things mean is that this is an area where law enforcement, essentially by definition, cannot be as effective as it can in many other areas of sort of more traditional crime. And I think kind of query is that analogous in some ways to part of what we saw with the sophistication of the activity we were dealing with in the market crisis. But as a result, all of the other modes that we have as a kind of economic organization of trying to protect ourselves against this sort of activity have to come into play and play a more important role because the role of law enforcement is diminished. And in particular, this means trying to persuade potential victims to act in a way that would reduce their likelihood of becoming successful targets or victims of cybercrime. This includes both entities and individuals. And so what are the ways that we typically influence behavior like that? And one is we use the civil justice system. So if there's a breach, you file a class action lawsuit. You may, in certain circumstances, be able to bring negligence actions. I mean, it's helpful, but pretty problematic. The civil liability rules that people have tried to apply to the cybersecurity area have not tended to fit very well. They're based, many of them, on sort of property and contract theories that have their origins sometimes hundreds of years ago, and it really are not a good fit for this particular type of activity. We can rely on economic self-interest, the sort of free market theory that you create a system where people will hopefully act in their own self-interest and avoid being attacked because it's bad to be attacked. The limitation to this is that you have a lot of people who don't recognize the nature of the risk, or they don't recognize it until too late. And you also have situations where entities that pose significant risks may not have an adequate incentive to protect the others that depend on them. So for example, you think about the Target's heating, ventilation, and air conditioner vendor, which was the vector through which Target Corporation's massive breach occurred. The scale of the risk that they posed to their third party, Target, was far more than the nature of the risk that it made sense for that firm to protect against, kind of just thinking about itself. And then finally, we have sort of what's the question of what's the role of the government in this area, and what's the role for regulatory standards. I mean, this is also not a particularly satisfactory approach to the problem. I mean, it's hard for me to think of anything worse than the notion of the government trying to micromanage how firms and individuals do cybersecurity. I mean, that's a reputation, or a recipe for disaster. But regulations in this area do have some role in terms of potentially fostering a culture and conversations about compliance, and at least setting a bar that then some of these other parts of the ecosystem can build on. So how at the SEC have we been kind of thinking about this area? Because it's an area that we have really spent a lot of time thinking about over the last 2 or 3 years, and significantly increased our activity in. So with respect to our registered entities and the firms in the securities business, we have what I would describe as very much principles-based regulation. It's not the FINRA rulebook. We have a handful of rules that apply in different ways to different market participants, but at the core of each of those rules is the concept of reasonableness. We have been attempting to communicate with firms about the agency's expectations and our areas of interest. There's been guidance from policy divisions in the exam program. We've been attempting to communicate about the risks that we're finding through the examination program. We've been attempting to engage industry and security professionals about what they're seeing out there to inform our activity in the space. We've made a deliberate decision to lead our work in this area through our examination program, not the enforcement program, with the notion that we're using that in part as an education and push. But at the same time, we also have brought a handful of enforcement actions, and I expect we'll continue to do so. The notion is that if we tell you there are issues out there, and we eventually can't get your attention and you just won't take this issue seriously, there is a point at which the government, the SEC, needs to have the ability to sort of hit somebody over the head with a 2x4 to get their attention. And we don't want to have to do that often. And one of the things I was thinking about as John was talking is that a kind of frustrating thing about any enforcement process is that the success is often measured in terms of numbers of enforcement actions, and that really misses the point. I mean, what we're about as an agency, and both as an exam and enforcement program, is sort of diminishing the level of harm. And so we need to, and I think particularly in the cybersecurity area, trying to be very careful about calibrating the level of enforcement to what we think is required to push the industry attention to this issue to where we think it should be. What we keep telling people is that we're not the reason for them to be thinking about cybersecurity. There are lots of far better reasons. But if they can't do it, if they can't focus on it without our help, we can do that. And then on the sort of more market-facing side, so once we're away from our registered firms and we're dealing with kind of third parties attacking our market infrastructure, that's a much more difficult challenge for us because we face all of the difficulties in enforcement that law enforcement does. And we're dealing with foreign actors going to pretty extraordinary lengths to prevent their efforts from detection. But we've made a concentrated effort to build the expertise to take on those cases. We've built partnerships with the law enforcement and intelligence communities in this area. And we are developing more sophisticated tools for detection of anomalous activity that we can then attempt to trace back to or use to potentially identify cybercrime. We are also working on improving our internal coordination in this area. One of the things that I think we recognized was true with respect to cybersecurity, and I think you can potentially suggest is true in some other areas where the SEC operates, is that the agency is not always kind of thinking as a whole with the voices and interests of all the different components of the agency in terms of what should our aggregate policy be. And we're trying through communication and coordination to make that a core part of our response to this issue. We're also thinking very carefully about how we manage our own security, because as we're becoming more aggressive in our examinations, we don't want to become sort of a one-stop shop for vulnerability information about the industry. We are seeing improvements in the industry's focus on this. Hard to know how much of that is our efforts, how much of that is the industry really through a lot of very good industry organization efforts really has begun to focus on this at the level that it needs to. There are a lot of really challenging issues for firms in this area. The one that we see repeatedly is who owns the cybersecurity issue. To the extent that there are rules in this area, it's in part a compliance problem. Compliance people don't typically have the technology expertise. On the other hand, the IT people don't necessarily understand the full scope of the risks that they are dealing with. So as a result, part of what we focus on when we go look at firms and talk to them is how they're approaching the governance issue. But this is a challenge that I think we see very much as one that we share with the industry and sort of with the broader public. It's one that is absolutely going to play out for years, if not decades. And I think how we collectively deal with it, how we make it a part or sort of not as a compliance culture, it really will be critical to our collective success in this area.
Very good.
Thank you.